What is the scariest story you know that is 100% true? I grew up in Troy, Michigan. I vividly remember one nice summer day being out in the front yard when I was about 5 years old. My mother was hunched over in the bushes cleaning up the yard. A blue gremlin car pulled up with two guys in it. The meaner looking bald guy on the passenger side waved me over towards the car. I looked back towards my mother, and as she stood up, the car floored it and took off down the road. It was only a few months later. The news reported suspicions that the Oakland County child killer might drive a blue gremlin. I have told the police about this. I'm not sure if it's the same guy, but I remember that car and those two guys very clearly, even today. I live in California and hike up the hills behind my house nearly every night. Last summer at about 1:30 a.m., about halfway up the hill on a dirt switchback trail was an empty wheelchair, obviously from a hospital. It seemed nearly impossible to get a wheelchair up to that point in such a rough trail. No lights, no people, just an empty wheelchair. I took a picture on my phone and sent it to my brother because it seemed so creepy. I make it to the top of the hill and then head back down. It's about 3:15 a.m. I get back to that spot and the wheelchair is gone. Again, no lights, no people, no other footprints. I still had the picture on my phone, so I knew I wasn't imagining things. So, let's go from the start. We just moved into a new house, and I never really thought anything about it. But in the first day there, I started hearing noises, still just thinking it's in my head. So the next day comes around, and I'm getting ready to transfer to a new school, so I'm still home for like a week or two. I'm eating, playing on my phone, I think on Clash of Clans. I was just chilling and eating, but then my battery went from 92% to 15%. After that happened, like 5 seconds later, I feel a scratch on the back of my neck, and I get terrified. Now, I checked it out, and there were 3 claw marks on my neck. This is getting long, so to cut it short, we moved out fast when my mom got scared from sounds. No one knows about this except me and Reddit. So I found this out about a week ago. There's this kid at my school who's about 16, who along with his older brother and father were the first people on scene at this horrific truck crash. I think it was a gas tanker, and the driver went too fast around a corner and tipped. He was trapped. The kid from my school and his family rushed out of the car to help him, and upon realizing they couldn't pull him out, among the panic, somehow the kid was left alone as his father and brother sped off to the fire station nearby as they were part of the brigade. They were hoping to use the hose and everything to put out the flames, but it was too late. Everything burst into flames, and the kid had to watch and listen as this man screamed and begged for his life, for him to come help, for him to reach into the burning vehicle and get his phone to tell his wife and children that he loved them. I think by this point, there was another lady standing with him just as helpless. But just imagining it is so terrifying. He now is in extensive therapy and has PTSD, and is just a shell of a person that he used to be.
Candace Newmaker was a 10-year-old girl who was adopted by a nurse in North Carolina. She was having some trouble relating to her new family. So, on recommendation by a family counselor, her and her mother traveled to Colorado to perform a rebirthing ceremony. This ceremony involved her recreating her birth in order to feel more attachment to her mother. During the 70-minute ordeal, Candace was wrapped in thick blankets and pillows to simulate the birth canal and told to push her way out of the blankets. In addition to the blankets, therapists and even her mother sat on top of her, adding additional weight that caused her to start suffocating. When she cried that she couldn't do anything, they proceeded to call her a quitter and told her she was weak. There's many more horrifying details you can read in the article, but eventually she died due to lack of oxygen. The people who performed the ceremony only got 16 years in prison.
I used to work at a gymnastics gym that had parkour classes. I made friends with this guy who was a regular, and he was really cool and nice. I stopped working there, and a few years later I randomly got curious about him, so I looked him up on Facebook to find an article about him where he stabbed and killed his mom. He was found and arrested while he was walking around with her blood still on his clothes. Apparently, it was a random psychotic episode from undiagnosed and untreated bipolar disorder, and something was telling him he needed to kill her to save her. His dad has been incredibly supportive of him. He was found not guilty by reason of insanity. So crazy that you can be a completely normal, functioning person, and then something wild like that happens, and not only did your mom die brutally, but you're the reason why. Ah! I kid you not. One time my brother went to a Boy Scouts summer camp. The dean or whatever warned everyone that someone might be on campus. In the middle of the night, my brother's boyfriend, who tented with my brother, left his tent to pee in the woods. There was a man standing there. At first, boyfriend thought he was just peeing too, but he just stood there. Boyfriend raced back to the tent and woke my brother up and told him what happened. They woke up boyfriend's grandpa and told him. Nothing came of it. However, a few weeks later, the man was on the news for being arrested for several things. My Boy Scout troop calls the story Mystery Man, and boyfriend recites it every time we go to the camp. My grandfather is a murderer. When my mom was about 8, she and her little sister were told to ride the school bus to their grandmother's house instead of coming home, because they were going to be staying at their grandparents' for the weekend. They thought it was just a fun weekend and that their mother, father, and their third sister, who was about 3 and not in school yet, would be joining them soon. They didn't know that their mother was planning to tell her husband she was leaving him for another man that day and didn't want the older kids around, adding to the drama. Turns out the husband didn't take this incredibly well, because his response was to shoot his wife, his youngest child, and then himself. My grandmother survived a shotgun wound to the stomach and had to crawl past the body of her 3-year-old child to get to the neighbors and ask them to phone the police. My mother and my aunt were not told about any of this until they were teenagers. They were told their father and sister died in an accident and not allowed to talk about it. They only found out when my mom found a newspaper article about it. Everyone in that side of my family up for life. It was June 4th, 2017. I was alone at home since my parents had gone out to do the monthly shopping. My phone rang at around 4 p.m. It was my aunt. She was my dad's second cousin, but we were very close. Anyway, I pick up the phone and we chat for like 20 minutes or so. Everything is completely normal, and then I end the phone call. When my parents came home about 5 or 10 minutes later, my mom was sobbing and my dad had tears in his eyes. My aunt had killed herself earlier that afternoon. When I told them I had just talked to her, they didn't believe me, so I went to show them the call logs. Guess what? My phone didn't work. It was new and had no problems, but it would never switch on after that. To this day, I'm creeped out about what happened and still don't know if it was a figment of my imagination or not. John List killed his whole family, wife, mother, daughter, and 2 sons. He meticulously planned the whole thing, canceling all delivery services, excusing the kids from school, and even turned the air conditioning as low as possible to preserve the bodies for as long as possible. After he killed them, he placed the bodies in sleeping bags and lined them up. He then wrote a letter to his pastor explaining why he had killed them. He pretty much explained that he killed his family to ensure their entry into heaven because he was worried they were straying from their faith. So in a way, he thought he was saving their souls. He then leaves and isn't heard from again. 18 years later, he's remarried and doing the same job as before, but this time he doesn't have any children. He's finally arrested after a tip was given to the FBI. Crazy thing is that because he planned it so well, the bodies weren't discovered until a month after the murders. So he had a huge head start and essentially started a new life in the same career and was heavily involved in the new church down in Virginia. Took 18 years to capture him. Killers like that are the scariest. He thought he had a noble reason, but in reality, he was crazy. In my town in the early 90s, there was a notorious killer that had all of BC, Canada on watch. My wife's mother, years and years before I knew them, had been home alone while her husband was in England doing tree surgeon work, arborist. She was in her laundry room when a man walked up from her basement, completely scaring her. She freaked out and said, "What the hell are you doing here?" He said he was friends with her husband and was just coming to see if he was here. Apparently, he told him he could just walk in, which she knew was bullshit. She was smart enough to tell him that he was just at the store and would be back any minute. He said he would wait outside for him. As soon as he left, she called the police, but he was long gone by that time. 2 weeks later, the killer was caught. His mugshot put on TV, and it was the guy in her house. An acquaintance of mine sent his son to triathlon camp in Texas. A week later, his son came back from camp. The next day, the son was complaining of a headache. 4 days later, he was dead. Healthy, happy, fit 12-year-old 1 week, dead the next. Turns out the lake had Naegleria fowleri, the brain-eating amoeba. Nothing scares me as irrationally as being dead and waiting for your body to catch on. Nigleria is terrifying to me. You can just get it from getting water up your nose in a lake, or there have been people who got it from using a neti pot. My dad and some friends got drunk and went for a drive on some back roads and were going as fast as the truck would go as teenagers. My dad was slightly less drunk than the others and eventually demanded they let him get out. They pulled over and he and one other girl got out. He and the girl started walking to town while the other three sped off in the opposite direction. Well, less than a mile up the road from where they got out is an extremely sharp turn, which they missed and hit a tree going pretty close to triple digits miles per hour. Two of them died on impact, and the only reason the third survived is because they crashed in front of a house that two doctors lived in. The survivor was paralyzed and lost his leg and part of his arm and was in the hospital for 8 months before dying. This was in the 60s, so medical care wasn't what it is today. When I first got my permit, my dad took me to that corner to explain the importance of safe driving. It gave me goosebumps about how close he was to being in the truck. He said that the dad of the driver got what remained of the truck to be hung in the center of town for months afterwards to be a warning to all. Tough to pick just one because there is true evil in humanity out there. Stuff like the Blood Eagle ritual is pretty awful, but in terms of really scary, probably stuff that just kind of happens on accident. Like the story of Kyle Plush, just awful. He was in a minivan that has one of those back seats that you can push forward to lay flat in the trunk for extra storage space. He went to grab something in the trunk, leaning over the seat, and it tipped backward and pinned him upside down against the back of the car in a position such that he couldn't get himself out. He called the police twice. The second time he called and gave them a very clear description of the car. Plush called 911 again at around 3:35 p.m. Police said this time he provided a description of the vehicle as he desperately pleaded for help but couldn't hear the dispatcher. Isaac said the information didn't get relayed to officers at the scene. "This is not a joke," the teen said over 911. "I'm almost dead." He asked the dispatcher to tell my mom I love her if I die. I still don't know why the hell they couldn't have gotten to him in time. His parents have filed a lawsuit over this because honestly, there's no reason that child should have died as long as he was on that phone with 911. This happened to me, and I've posted about it before. I was around 11 years old, and I woke up in the middle of the night to a man straddled on top of me with his hand over my mouth and nose. He told me to roll over and not to scream. I rolled onto the floor and tried to scream bloody murder. I say tried because when you are truly terrified, it can take a second to find your voice. My mom heard me screaming and came in and fought with the guy. He was at least 6 foot. She was 5'3", and scared him enough with the fighting and screaming that he took off out the window he had come in through. They never did catch him. Told this here before, but once more. My friend had this neighbor who was a retired mechanic. They lived on some properties with large front lawns and long driveways. His neighbor had a couple derelict cars parked up near his garage that he took parts from occasionally. This neighbor of his started hearing noises while sitting in his living room, coming from his front yard. Every time he'd go to the window, there would be nothing there. He assumed it was a raccoon or a coyote or whatever. He kept hearing the noise, so he'd go out to look around, but would find nothing. He'd put out traps and occasionally catch something, yet the noise persisted. Soon, he started claiming that he was hearing voices coming from the front yard, like whispering. He'd go outside and look around the perimeter of his property, but would find nothing. It was persistent, so he started calling the cops. Every time the cops came and looked around, they would find nothing. So they told him he needed to stop calling them for this, and perhaps get a security camera or something. So this guy thought he was losing his mind. One summer evening, he couldn't sleep, so he went to the back patio to smoke a cigarette. Suddenly, he heard voices coming from the front of his house. He put his cigarette out and snuck around the front and got there just in time to see the doors to his derelict conversion van silently shut. He ran back to the backyard and went inside of his home and called the police to tell them what he had seen. The police arrived and approached cold, i.e., without lights or sirens. When they approached the van, the doors swung open and a bunch of people ran out in every direction. Upon searching the van, the cops found syringes and paraphernalia and determined that people were shooting up in there. Michael and his friends decided to explore an old abandoned hospital that was rumored to be haunted. As they entered the building, they heard strange noises and felt an eerie presence around them. They brushed it off as their imagination and continued exploring. As they reached the top floor, they found a room filled with old medical equipment and files. Suddenly, the door slammed shut, trapping them inside. The temperature dropped, and they heard the sound of a heart monitor beeping in the distance. They tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as they realized they were not alone. They saw a ghostly figure dressed in hospital scrubs staring at them. The figure started moving towards them, and they screamed in terror. Suddenly, the door opened, and they ran out of the building, never looking back. They never spoke of the incident again. But I mean, they must have for this guy to be able to know the story, right? Okay, so my family and I went for a picnic in the mountains. Everything was going well until my friend and I decided to go on a nature trail. After about 20 minutes of walking, my friend spotted something white in the distance. She asked me if I could see it, but I couldn't. No, I said, and then she took a picture of it on her phone. Then I saw it on the picture. We decided to go check it out. When we were looking at it from about 5 meters away, we realized it was a body. It was wearing a white dress. We both screamed and ran back to the place where everyone was and told them about it. They didn't believe us. But in the end, my dad said he was going to go and check just to calm us down. He then came back with a shocked and terrified look on his face and told my mom to call the cops. Since there is no service in the mountains, we drove a bit lower down and called them. When they arrived, they followed us to the location, and it turned out to be the infamous serial killer's doing that still hasn't been caught. This was 4 years ago. So last year, I went to the UK for an international business competition, Bayo Master, where we stayed at Oundle University, located on the outer areas of Peterborough. So it was freezing for me, since I am a South American guy, and me and my friend went to buy ice cream. Yeah, ice cream while it's like -0 degrees Celsius. So we were walking back to the apartment, and from a dark alleyway, we started to hear a screaming, "Help! Help!" 2 times, very loud, and then again, "Help! Help!" We looked at each other and started to run, and a dark figure started following us. As we turned the corner for the apartment, the figure stopped and turned back. For some idiotic reason, I went back to see if it was actually a person. But as I pointed my phone's flashlight at it, it disappeared. And not even shitting you, the fucking bells of the cemetery struck 6 times. It was 11:30.